Hi everyone, I'm Cal Spriggs. Today I'm going to show you how I built the third of my epic Gallowdark terrain tiles for playing with Warhammer 40k, Necromunda, Kill Team, and other awesome wargames. In my previous two videos, I walked through how I built my first two tiles for a Gallowdark boarding action set of terrain. Like the other two, I wanted some height variation and to allow models to traverse the underdecks of the ship. I thought I would save some time and effort and bought 1 foot MDF sheets on Amazon. I figured they'd be just the right size and the edges would be straighter than me cutting them by hand with the box cutter. That was until I measured them. Yep, that's right, 1 foot MDF sheets that measure 11 3/4 inches. This is why I have trust issues. I decided to use them anyway. Adding a 1/8 inch overhang on each side shouldn't be too much of an issue. At least that was my hope. Stay tuned to see if that worked out. In the meantime, I started cutting some more 1-inch strips of cardstock, both to go around the edges of the tile's base and to provide cross bracing between the main deck supports. As part of this build, I wanted a tile at the center of the board. This was going to be the base of the reactor, and I spent some time placing other tiles to make sure I had it in just the right spot. The other two builds went great, both the prototype and the second build, and I wanted to step things up though and create a reactor jutting up through the floor that miniatures could fight over and around, and that would show the scale of the ship they fought aboard. Because the MDF sheet I bought wasn't exactly 12 inches, I had to keep adjusting where I placed things and doing math to make sure I would end up with a 12-inch tile. I didn't want gaps between this one and other tiles I put together, and I wanted everything squared off. So there was a lot of checking the spacing involved and cutting and adjusting the 1-inch supports. Having the square base down in the center meant I had to cut insets out of the supporting cardstock as well to make everything line up. Also, because the tile was twice as thick as the cardstock, I had to put down spacers to make sure the support pillars for the deck would sit level and flush. It was a few little finicky details that took some extra time, but getting everything lined up was certainly worth it. When you're working on a job like this where everything needs to be lined up, taking your time in the beginning to get everything right saves you a lot of time in the end. I've rushed jobs like this in the past, and you end up with a mess that takes a lot of time and effort to fix, or worse, having to start all over from the beginning. Once I had all the pieces cut and adjusted to fit, I started gluing them down. I used a hot glue gun for this, although I probably could have just used super glue. The cardstock stuck to the MDF with no issues, and for this build I decided against using plastic mesh for the deck plates. I actually ended up using corrugated paper in some areas, which I later coated with Mod Podge to help it hold up better, but we'll get to that later. For now, I just wanted to get all the supporting sections of cardstock in place and solidly glued down so that I had a sturdy base for the support pillars of the underdeck. With that done, I started working on the reactor. I had some found bits, what used to be a chewing gum package, part of a drink bottle, and the lid off a juice bottle, which is going to be my reactor, along with some 3D printed piping to connect them and the lid off a Sprite bottle to make that connection. It doesn't look like much at this point, I have to admit, but I was really excited about the potential, and you'll see the final product turned out great. Once I had the connection point trimmed to fit, I could start gluing the parts down. I wanted to build everything up around the reactor, as this is the centerpiece for the build. I had to make sure that I had it dead center, as I was going to have it coming up through a tile that I'd removed the center out of to make it fit. No pressure on me at all to make sure I had it lined up perfectly, right? The idea here is to sell the importance of the reactor, how everything else feeds into it or comes out of it. Lining up bits of 3D printed pipe and the toy pipe sections went fairly easily. It was actually the tiny straw sections that I used as fuel piping that were more difficult. These sections had 3D printed joints and T-connections, and I wanted them feeding into the reactor at various points, breaking up the surface a bit and adding some interest above decks as well as below. The hot glue sort of melted some of the straws though, and the straws themselves were small enough that getting them into the right place before the glue cooled off was kind of a pain. I'm not sure how well they'll hold up in the long term either. Still, once I had them in place, I felt they were worth the added effort. Since they were fuel pipes, they'd get painted red and would stand out in the subdeck area as well. I wanted these pipes sort of feeding in from all over the ship too, suggesting that all the different fuel tanks fed into this one reactor. I had 3D printed a set of arches that I scaled to support the deck above. These were Gothic style and I felt they fit the setting really well, complete with rivets and only lacking in skulls and double eagles. Maybe the ship predates the modern Gothic era, or maybe Chaos cultists have come through and removed the iconography. Who knows? I used the super glue to put the arch sections together and hot glue to secure them to the tile base. I also used some popsicle sticks as cross braces to provide some solid support so I could be certain that these would hold up. I covered the top of the reactor before I primed it all gray like the other tiles. I wanted that top to remain clear plastic for the lighting that I planned to put inside. The power conduits got a dry brush of silver to make them stand out a bit in parts of the reactor as well. Next I went through painting the fuel lines, giving them a red splotchy appearance to suggest the fuel they pump is probably highly toxic and corrosive. You know, good old Promethium. With how these feed in from everywhere, this really added a lot of visual interest in following the lines to see where they all lead. I then came through and painted the aqua-colored coolant line. The piping provided a nice contrast to the other two sections, both in size and color, again telling a story that the central piece is important. With the pipes painted, I came through and used burnt umber to give everything a good corroded look. I put this on the joints and seams of all the pipes and really heavily on the fuel lines as well, giving the whole area an aged and abandoned look. Several sections of plate that I'd put in the subdeck also got heavy coatings to represent corroded plates that have been affected by the Promethium fuel. If you guessed that the next step was brown wash, then you'd be correct. This went all over the surfaces, getting the really grimy look in down here. It wasn't the final step though, because I really wanted to make the reactor pop. For this step I used a titanium white, applying it to the rings of the reactor, establishing a good foundation that would stand out against the dreary and worn surfaces. My thought was that this reactor, despite being abandoned for centuries, is still somehow operating. As such, it is incredibly valuable to anyone boarding the ship, as they can use it to open doors, operate weapons and defenses, and maybe even bring on life support. I took my time painting the white, being sure I got a solid coating in the areas I wanted painted, as this was going to be central for the next stage. There was a lot of painting of white to do, especially down here near the bottom in the gallery area. While you watch me paint, I'll remind you to like and subscribe. This project was a lot of work and the feedback on it would be great. I've also got a lot more projects coming, so you won't want to miss them. With the white painted and dried, I transitioned to the neon green to show that this was a plasma reactor, somehow burning the promethium to generate plasma at the temperatures of a star. I don't know how that works, but most of the technology in Warhammer 40k doesn't make any sense anyway, so it is what it is. The neon green I hoped would make it clear that the reactor was still operational, and I figured that the lighting that I used on the other two tiles would really make it stand out. I will say I struggled to get an even paint job on the larger surfaces, especially with the curves. The paint stands out, but it's a pain to work with at times. This was especially true on the lower section. Still, I feel like it was worthwhile, as the reactor really started to look incredible with it painted. It went from a collection of random junk to something that looked like an ancient power reactor. That was pretty satisfying. After I finished painting the subdeck, I could move on to the deck plates. Once again, I had magnetized these to allow me access to the subdeck. I had lined everything up right, so I was able to get everything where it needed to go, which was a huge relief. I started painting on blue and white, mirroring the first two builds, although this time I used craft paint instead of contrast paint. It wasn't much of a difference, and I felt like the craft paint actually gave me better coverage on the big flat panels. I did some yellow and black hazard stripes over an access hatch, which should provide access to the gallery and the subdeck. I like labeling spots like that, as not only does it make the piece more interesting visually, but it also helps players to spot doors and access points as they're playing a game. A lot of the deck plates I used were deliberately chosen to provide as much vision below the deck as possible, as I wanted to light this tile up quite a bit to show the reactor was fully operational. The gallery had an open port over the bottom part of the reactor as well, again to provide as much of a view as I could on the functions of it. Something I'd realized at this point was that I hadn't really planned for how I would insert the bigger lights into the reactor to light it up from the inside. I considered cutting a hole in the MDF from underneath, but I was worried I would damage the whole piece. I came up with a solution later on, as you'll see, but it was something that had me sort of stumped. Once I had all the brighter colors on the deck plates, I transitioned to dulling them down with burnt umber, applied to give them a dirty, worn, and disused look. The goal here was to take it from clean and crisp to rusted and corroded and abandoned. This is the step that makes the tile firmly in the 41st millennium, giving it all the grimdark so that it feels like a properly dystopian setting. I used burnt umber craft paint for this, and like with the other tiles, I experimented with thinning it to different consistencies to get different variations in the paint. This let me use it like a heavy wash in some places and to lay on thick rust effects in others. All the decking got the treatment, which sold it as being worn and dilapidated, just the sort of place for people to kill and be killed over. Once I finished the weathering, I went into hitting it with the final brown wash. Like the other tiles I made, there was a tremendous sense of relief to have it at this final point. For better or worse, this thing was done. And here it is, the big reveal. I'm incredibly pleased with how this reactor tile came out. The painting on it sells it as an operational piece of equipment. The green lighting on top of that really makes it pop. I threw down some models on it, and later on, after the glory shots, I put it together with the other tiles and my in-progress bulkheads just to see it. This thing is really cool, and I'm proud to have made it. I'd love to hear what you all think. Feel free to comment below, and if there's anything I could do to make it even better, I'd love to hear it. Also, if you have suggestions for other tiles, I'm always looking for inspiration. Please hit like and subscribe. I've got more tiles done. I'll be getting those videos out soon, along with new walls and bulkheads to complete the set. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.